All right, gang, welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. Oh, but wait, even better, today, let's all gather around, children. Let's gather around in a semicircle because old lady Amy is going to be spinning us a tale. I don't know, it fits better if you're
Old
an old lady.
lady
Just
Amy.
roll with it, man. Just roll with it.
Oh
You're
my
going to be
God.
like the old granny telling us stories today. Story time with old lady Amy, acknowledging that I'm like 5 years older than Amy. So ignore the fact that if you're old, that means I'm older than dirt. So semicircle, huddle up. Tell us about your weekend.
I love how you're building this up in into something that's like, oh, so exciting and fun.
I
And
mean, we can make the most of it the title of the episode is going to
right,
give away what the
right,
story's about because people
right,
come here with an expectation. We're talking about food poisoning, but
right,
spin
right.
us a tale, old lady Amy.
Yeah. So this weekend, I was super pumped for it. So it had been something in the works for the last couple months,
Not the food
and
poisoning. That was not
not the food
intentional, right?
poisoning. I was going on a ski trip. So the closest ski resort that's decent in my area is in West Virginia. It's called Snowshoe. It's very fun. We went there a lot growing up. When we couldn't make it out west, we would go there. And my whole family was going. So except my little sister. I'm one of four kids. I'm the third. So my brother with his two kids and his wife, and then my sister with her son and her husband came, and my parents came, and then me. So it was like a big group of us. And Armand and I left Thursday to drive in the car, and we were all like nervous about how Cece's gonna do in the car and whatnot. But the whole plan was like we'd stop at one point. It's like a 6.5 hour drive. So we were gonna stop at somewhere to eat at some point along the way to get her out of the car, to just see some stuff and to eat lunch. But where we were in Ohio, so West Virginia is just kind of straight east of us. So we're heading east into very rural Ohio. There's really not like a Chipotle. Like some of the traditional places that we would go for like a quick bite would be like Chipotle or a Panera or something like that. Well, we get off an exit because Cece's starting to lose it. So we're like, okay, well, this exit didn't really have much. So the options were Bob Evans or BW3's, Buffalo Wild Wings, which some people didn't know what BW. I told a patient this. I was like, oh, is that Buffalo? I called it BW3's and she didn't know what that was. I don't know
I
if
have never
that's.
heard this, and I went to college in Buffalo, just for the record. Although
Oh,
it's not a
really?
Buffalonian franchise. It's based in like Cincinnati or something, so they're dirty, rotten liars. Anyway, continue.
Anyway, so I was kind of leaning more towards like, oh, if we go to Bob Evans, I can get like an egg or two. And like, I wasn't overly hungry. So I'm like, I'll just get something small and like an oatmeal or something basic, you know. But Iran's like, let's go to BW3's. And like, it was the NCAA tournament. So I'm like, well, at least I can watch basketball while we eat. So I was like, okay, fine. So we go there. I'm like, I'll just get like a salad or something. Then we go there. I get a salad. This is literally the worst salad I've ever seen, like presented. And we even joke. We're like, this food is terrible. Like, we're gonna
If
get
only
sick.
you
Like we were
knew.
I know, we were joking. That's what was funny after the fact. But it didn't taste spoiled. It just was like, iceberg lettuce with just gobs of like bacon bits or whatever, chicken. It was like a Cobb salad, eggs. They put tomatoes on it, but they didn't like dice it. It just looked like multiple slices of tomato like you would put on a burger. It was so strange. And that was the only vegetable on it, which I was so confused after the fact. But anyway, so I ordered that. And again, like I literally probably ate, a quarter or a half of the salad. It wasn't very good. And so we're kind of munching on this. I'm feeding Cece. So like she's in a little booster seat and she didn't eat anything there. We just kind of fed her the food we had. She's not really probably up to that level of diversity yet. So we're kind of feeding her baby food. Everything was fine. No, like the food didn't taste spoiled. It just tasted like shitty food, if that makes sense. So we get in the car and we leave and there was a wreck, so we were kind of stressed out. And then we finally arrive at Snowshoe. Without incident, no symptoms yet. So that's like, again, we might have eaten at noon. We arrived at Snowshoe around 6. So I get to Snowshoe. I actually have a yogurt as a snack because I was hungry. So I had a yogurt and something out, maybe like a bar of some sort as a snack. And then I meet my family out for like a really late dinner. So maybe like 8 or something we ate. And Armand stayed back with Cece. So again, no symptoms at this point. Then I get back. Armand calls me and says Cece's like freaking out. He's worried that people are going to complain in the hotel about her crying. And I'm like, Armand, no one's going to complain.
Mike would worry about that too. They are the same human being in 2 different bodies.
Right. But it's like 9 p.m. Like I'd understand maybe if it was like midnight or 11 or something. But yeah, he was like, please come back. Like she's freaking out and whatever. Like, of course, when I come back, she settles down because seems to be a little bit more preferential to me these days. So she's fine when I get back. But like the second she goes to sleep, just the wave of the most intense nausea ever. And I was like, ugh, this isn't good. But I felt at first like it might have been some sort of after effect from the drive because the windiness of the roads. So I've had that happen to me before because I felt a little nauseous on the roads, or I've had a little bit of like an after effect of being on windy roads. So I have had that happen before. So I was like, oh, this is like some very intense thing. But I felt fine eating the meal that I had out with my family, and a pretty big meal too. So then all of a sudden I was like, it feels like I'm going to throw up. But mind you, I have not thrown up probably in like 10 years. I typically like have a very strong, in a weird way, even like through my gut issues, I'm just not a big thrower-upper. I don't like throwing up. Like I don't have a phobia of it, but I just like, ugh. Some people, again, are like, oh, I'll throw up, get this out of my system, and I'll be good to go. They almost look forward to that purge. I'm not like that. Like I don't.
Particularly with booze. Like, oh, if I puke, then I'll feel better.
Right. Had tons of friends like that in college.
I never
grossed me
that
out.
personally.
That grossed me out. I did not like that. But anyway, so like suddenly at around 10, it's just everything's coming out, especially vomiting at first. So vomiting violently, it's like through the nose. It's just terrible, terrible, terrible. And then again, like I had just eaten probably another crappy meal, big meal right before too. So it's like all that's coming up. Armand's like, yeah, I don't feel super great either, but like nowhere near where I was. And I'm like, yeah, I think you're okay. And again, I'm vomiting probably from like 10 at night till about 1 or 2 in the morning. Not like consistently, but I probably vomited 3 or 4 times. And then I started like pooping, then the poop's coming. It's coming out both ends, ping-ponging out both ends. And again, I feel like my severe symptoms like that wrapped up around 2 or 3 a.m. But I had like a minor fever, chills, muscle achy type stuff that kept me from going to sleep. I think at some point I might have taken like a Tylenol, or I took a Tylenol at some point just to help me sleep, and that did help. But I probably only slept for like 2 or 3 hours that night because it was just miserable. But Armand started vomiting then at like when mine started wrapping up, that's when he went down for the count, and he was just vomiting horrible. And then you're like listening to the other person vomit, and so.
And you were saying there was only one bathroom because you're in like a lodge or a hotel room.
Yeah. So thank God we weren't like flared up at the same time. Because like I said, mine was much quicker through my system with the severe symptoms. So the actual purge part seemed much faster for me than Armand. And I was telling you this, that I almost wonder eating that yogurt, if that might have helped a little bit, because I know fermented foods can inhibit some of the food poisoning bugs. Like if it just did minorly helped a bit. So anyway, so yeah, then our mom kicks up, and the whole next day, again, I felt terrible, and I might have like had diarrhea once or something, but it wasn't a consecutive thing where my husband was just like nonstop pooping. Like there was nothing coming out. I even think it was like getting a little bit bloody. You know, it was like getting a little concerning because I was very close to taking him to urgent care because he would just like couldn't hold even water. Like it was hard for him to drink because he would just poop it out or throw it up, you know? So he was like very severe. And then taking care of Cece during this time was just like, I was like putting on her like little YouTube show and just hoping for the best. She was on her own.
Well, I get a text from you. What was it, Friday morning? I get a text from you that's like, send help. Armand and I both down with bad food poisoning. Cece's on her own.
Right.
And I get an adorable picture of Cece sitting on the floor. She looked happy as a camper.
Right. She actually was very good, which was like the saving grace of the whole experience. But yeah, it was just a crazy weekend. And again, I think I've been feeling so that happened Thursday and this is Thursday, late Thursday. I'm finally feeling a little bit more back to normal, but I felt kind of nauseous. Even when the major symptoms kind of died down, I've still had a little bit of nausea and kind of took a little bit for my bowel movements to get back to normal, but now they're more back to normal. But yeah, it's so crazy because I've never had a food poisoning incident before. I feel as though I've had some minor stomach bugs previous, but nothing nothing food based, where I could say, oh yeah, it was definitely that meal. And I think for one thing that's interesting is like, I think probably how we got it at the BW3s was just poor prep practices. I don't think it was because we ate different things. So like if a worker has touched raw food and then it's preparing your food, that's how they can transfer the bug to your meal. Or sometimes it's a toxin. When it's funny because when we had the food poisoning in school, we actually had to take Serve Safe, which is a whole course on how to properly prepare and store food, essentially, to avoid foodborne illness. Sometimes you have to do it if you like are a manager of a restaurant or something like that. But we had to do it. And I remember in that, and it's actually on the RD exam and stuff, is just different bugs, like different microbes and what the symptoms are and the onset time. But that's kind of a whole interesting investigation too. My nerd brain was like, I'm going to refer back to the list of all the food poisoning microbes. Look at the onset times. What's the most likely scenario? Like,
Fetch
what
me
are we
my binder.
Right. What are we looking at in terms of time that this is going to take to move through my system? What kind of bug is this? Like, just the curiosity side of my brain was turned on. So I think, again, based on the onset of when the symptoms came and the symptoms, I think it was one of two bugs. Well, one's not really a bug. It's more the toxin from the bug. But I think it's either Salmonella or Staphylococcus aureus toxin, which you apparently don't really get sick from the bug, but you get sick from the toxin that the bug makes that can be on the food. But both, again, don't affect the taste. Like, they don't taste rotten. And the symptoms line up and the onset, like the time from when you eat it till the time symptoms show up aligned.
Yeah, the delay.
And the symptoms matched. So those are the only two that seem to make sense based on all those factors. I'm starting to think, just based on how long it took for things to kind of move through and normalize, that it was probably Salmonella, but I can't say that for sure. The way that the nausea came on really fast apparently is more common with like Staph aureus toxin. Seems like sudden severe nausea and vomiting, which was very consistent to what I felt, where it's like boom, like very strong wave. But I don't think that can rule it out. But it is funny, if you do have a food poisoning incident, it's not fun to go through at all, but I found it a little bit fun to try to investigate as to like who is the bug? Where in the world
The
did I
silver
get this?
lining, you can
Right.
wag a finger disapprovingly at that bug.
Right. Right.
Well, here's a
Screw you,
question.
salmonella.
Here's the question too. I don't know if people commonly do this, but would you ever consider calling that particular Buffalo Wild Wings and saying, "Hey, my husband and I got food poisoning at your establishment. You need to make sure your employees are washing their hands and stuff."
Yeah, we debated it, and I actually think it's probably a good practice to do that. I don't know. We were just so like sick and trying to get through it that we didn't, but probably to protect other people that would have been a better move. But it was I mean, and think about it too. There was tons of people in there because of March Madness. And again, it's crazy.
Bet you weren't the only ones that got food
Yeah.
poisoning. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's oh. And I bet that you won't want to go back to a Buffalo Wild Wings anytime soon either.
No. I don't even, again, I don't particularly like Buffalo Wild Wings. It's not like one of my go-tos, but it was again kind of the only thing on the exit that we could kind of sit down and feed Cece and just like chill for a minute. But yeah, it was something else. But
And could we take 1 minute to publicly make fun of your husband? Because I've been cracking up about this.
yeah,
The first thing that you ate, oh, smart dietitian friend of mine, the first thing you ate when you felt a little bit better and felt like you could keep something down was yogurt, which is good for your microbiome.
right.
The first thing your dear husband put in his body when he felt a smidgen better,
Gummy bears.
gummy bears.
Yeah.
Like you do.
Right. You know, we haven't really talked that much about Armand and his eating habits, but he is for sure my biggest project. I'm not the type that tries to be very forceful, or it's just not my personality type. If you're not going to eat a certain way, I'm not going to try to force you. But he doesn't really love vegetables. And again, he eats a lot more junk food than I think he needs. But yeah, he
Gummy bears.
was like, "Oh yeah, I ate some gummy bears." And I'm like, "Oh, good Lord. Like, could we think of anything better? Like, you just stopped shitting for the 50th time, and the first thing down your gullet is going to be little sugar bears."
Yep. It's pretty
Yeah.
on brand for Armand, but
Yeah. Yeah, I was
You
sticking
know-
to like, so I think I started, yogurt was like very close. I started with a little piece of bread just to kind of see, could I keep that down? And then I had a yogurt pretty quickly after that. And then I kept eating yogurt each consecutive day because I did have yogurt with us, but which I think again, probably onboarding some fermented foods if you are having a food poisoning incident is really helpful. The other thing that sucked, because we were in the middle of the mountains, there's really no grocery store that's within like probably a 45 to 60 minute drive would be, and you're going down the windy mountain again.
getting queasy again.
Right. So there is like a general store on the top of the mountain that had Pepto-Bismol and electrolyte stuff, that sort of thing. But there wasn't really any place I could get stuff like charcoal or other things that I would have on hand at home
Yeah.
to help me with a food poisoning incident. So,
And that brings up a pointer. So I will say, and maybe I should have said this at the beginning of the episode, story time around circling around and hearing the story was one goal for today's episode. But now to kind of make it practical for the people at home, I would like to have a little bit of a conversation of how, like in an ideal world, say that you get food poisoning and you're at home, how might one maybe prevent food poisoning. I don't know if that's super well researched even, but like any strategies to maybe prevent food poisoning experiences, or like what can you do at the first onset of symptoms? And then we'll talk about how this relates to IBS and SIBO a little bit towards the end. But I've even, well, tangenting for just 1 second. So food poisoning can be a cause of disrupted motility, and it can lead to SIBO for some people. And I've worked with some people where they're like, oh man, I've had food poisoning a bunch of times. Like they know it's a root cause. They were never the same since. And they say, my body is just super, super sensitive now to food poisoning, which I find very interesting. Like I remember one lady, and she said, my wife and I could eat the exact same meal from the exact same restaurant. Like we order one thing and we split the same order even. I will get food poisoning and she will have mild symptoms or no symptoms even.
Right.
And for people like that, where I'm like, all right, either you know that you're really sensitive to this and you get food poisoning easily, or, you know, we know that it's a root cause for your SIBO and we don't want it to trigger a relapse of your SIBO. Some of the strategies that I've told people is charcoal, as you've alluded to, some sort of binder to bind up the bacterial toxin. But for those people in particular, I've told them before, pack the bottle of charcoal with you because like you experienced, you don't want to be stuck on a mountain or at a resort or in a country where you don't speak the language. And then you're scrambling at the last possible minute, or your family is scrambling trying to find you a damn bottle of charcoal. You might as well just take the $10 bottle of charcoal with you if you know that that's something that's a concern for you. Now, you had said you had never had food poisoning before. So it wasn't even like on your radar as something that you needed to really think about. But yeah, charcoal at the first onset of any symptoms could be beneficial. The other thing I would probably think of is like some sort of tummy settling down something. So like ginger or ginger tea or even ginger ale. I know a lot of people drink ginger ale to settle their stomach. Those are the things that I would probably think of. I don't know if there's evidence for this, but I could also kind of theorize that if you had some oregano, like oregano supplement on hand, that maybe a little bit of a dose of oregano oil could be helpful, kind of kicking the bacteria sooner. I didn't research it prior to this call though, so I don't know if that's actually research-based.
Yeah, I think fermented foods as well could be helpful, like in terms of adding a few things in. Like if you can stomach it, eating a few ferments could be helpful. I also really wonder too if something like an SBI or an IgG type supplement would be helpful, as they are binders as well.
Yeah.
In terms of like binding up endotoxins, and apparently they can bind to the actual pathogenic microbes too. So again, that's something I've incorporated since being home, more like colostrum type stuff. So I typically personally like colostrum a little bit better than SBI and IgG. It has IgG in it, but you can buy immunoglobulins separate as like a serum bovine immunoglobulin supplement. That's more expensive. I find that the colostrum has more peptides and things in it outside of the IgG, so maybe I just like some of those as well. But if you tolerate it, it's very anti-inflammatory. It has binding potential. It settles the stomach. So I've really liked colostrum. I found too, like in some stubborn cases I had a family member that had C. diff, which again's a gut infection. It's not really foodborne. I wouldn't think typically, unless someone who had it transferred it onto the food. But SBI be really helpful for C. diff, in preventing C. diff in people that have had like chronic infections and are sort of in the process of like, oh, we cleared it, but they're in the process of clearing it and keeping it away.
Yeah, like they're teetering on the edge.
Right. Right. So SBI seems to be helpful for that as well. But yeah, I mean, I was doing a little bit of digging into research on SBI and colostrum because generally I found it to be helpful for infections that are a little teetery, like you were saying, and just generally pretty anti-inflammatory. So
Well, and that's
I've been doing that, and that seems to help that weirdly, and it could have just been a natural running the course of my food poisoning personally, but that I took 1 or 2 doses of that and it seemed to just basically take the nausea down to nothing. I don't know if, again, it just naturally would have gone down to nothing, but I was still pretty nauseous Monday evening going into the Persian New Year. So the Persian New Year was Monday. It's called Nowruz. So we went to my husband's family and they made like this huge meal. And it was so good. I actually did eat a decent amount of it. But I again took that, and it's just only a few doses seem to really help me. There could be a placebo, I don't know, but usually again I'm pretty much like, oh, this might help a little bit. Like I'm not usually overly like
You're not
banking on a
super
supplement
placebo-y.
making a huge effect to go from probably a decent amount of nausea to no nausea. But yeah, it did seem to really help. So that certainly is something to try. I don't think it would hurt anything to try. It's pretty benign.
And that's a good point, too, because one of the things that happens with food poisoning for some people, the way that it is a root cause for IBS and SIBO, is that it instigates an inflammatory immune response, and that's what ends up disrupting your motility. So even from that angle of, the anti-inflammatory benefit of it, in addition to the binding of the pathogen, the binding of the toxin, et cetera, et cetera, I could see that working well for this on multiple angles. That's a really good point.
Yeah, and again, I think that the binding is so important. Like what you were saying, the charcoal, like I said too, the IgG binds. Anytime that you can bind it and remove it more efficiently is going to help mitigate the inflammation quicker. So yeah, I think that's such an important part. I also didn't mention this too, but my milk supply was like, F you, like it just totally went from being like too much to just like nil to where
Shriveled up to a raisin.
Right. Cece's like putting my boob in her mouth and like immediately popping off and just staring at me. Like, what's happening?
What have you done, woman?
I know. So I was really pushing the calories up quicker than I naturally would have because I wanted to get my supply back up a bit. So that was probably playing a little bit into my nausea as well because I was like, screw this. I need to pump up the calories, and how can I force this a bit? Which is never a fun thing to do, but it is what it is. But
really quickly too, if I may, just before we get too far off of the topic, I meant to mention, because you had mentioned SBI a couple of times, just so people know, that is the serum-derived bovine immunoglobulins that you were talking about previously. So just in case people are like, what is SBI? Where do I get it? It's serum bovine immunoglobulins. I know there's one product called SBI Protect from a company called Orthomolecular. There might be others out there as well, but just FYI, I didn't want people to be confused.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's actually a pharma product called Interrogam too.
Yeah.
And I've had some people be able to get it from their doctor through Interrogam, get it covered by their insurance. Typically, I feel like it'd more be covered if you had like an IBD situation. That seems to be where they've done the majority of the research on SBI would be for IBD in particular. But again, in IBD, what do you have? An immune system that's going off the rails in the gut. And so again, with a food poisoning incident, the immune system is spazzing out for good reason because it's trying to help you eliminate this microbe and the toxins that the microbes are emitting. But I think in people that have post-infectious issues, that immune that inflammatory response from the immune system becomes dysregulated, and gets stuck there, and can cause problems, like you said, with motility and that kind of thing. But yeah, I really like SBI and IgG in acute situations like that too. So yeah, that can be helpful. And again, I really like charcoal in terms of an easy, cheap thing you
Super
can
cheap.
throw in that's going to bind to a lot of different toxins in the gut. That certainly could be a really helpful tool. Yeah,
It's
and
pretty well
then
tolerated too, because
yeah,
it's pretty. I don't want to call it benign because that kind of indicates it's not helpful, but it doesn't seem very harmful. The worst it's going to do is turn your poops kind of black, typically,
yeah,
or it's just not going to work really well. But it's like $10 a bottle. Doesn't usually have a lot of side effects. I would definitely take charcoal in capsules because if you get the powder, it's just a freaking mess and it goes everywhere. Some people have
right,
done that, and I'm like, no, no. So just get it
right.
in a capsule. The only thing to know about charcoal and binders in general is that you don't want to take it with prescription medications in particular, because then it's going to bind up your prescription and then you get a lower dose of the medication. So you want to take it on an empty stomach, away from food, away from supplements, away from medications in an ideal world. If you can't match all of those criteria, at the bare minimum, just don't take it with a medication. Or
Right.
don't take it with medication that you're hoping to absorb.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think in terms of preventing just food poisoning in general too. So we're talking about like, okay, if it happens, but if you are trying to prevent it, the main things to consider would be how you prep your meals. So like at home, how are you prepping your food, making sure you're doing it in a safe way. I know we've kind of joked before about family members in particular doing weird stuff with raw meat.
I'm already, no, I'll tell it again, just in case this is somebody's first episode with us, because I'm already like laughing internally at this. So, my dad is a ridiculous human being, and it is miraculous that my entire family doesn't get food poisoning every week being around this
Right.
man. I kid you not. And also, this is actually a side note. So, I have an uncle who worked in like the meat packing industry for a while. And kind of like sometimes he would complain about like, oh, the FDA inspections are such a pain in the butt, and like, oh, they made us, throw away some of the product and yada yada. And they kind of there's this air of like, oh, the man's cracking down on us, gosh
Right.
darn it. But the reason why we want our meat packing and our slaughterhouses and like all of that chain, we want the supply chain to be really, really clean because people like my dad exist in the world. And I can like, not only will he handle raw meat, and then, okay. I remember years ago, we lived with my parents for a short period of time and we moved in. And within the first week of us living with them, my dad goes to make steak. So he takes the steak on like the styrofoam tray or whatever that you get from the grocery store. He takes off the plastic, he salts the steak, and he brings it out to the grill. Cool. Well, then when the steak is done cooking, he brings it back on the bloody styrofoam tray that the raw meat was just on. And I don't know which one I'm more terrified of now at this point. I'm like, okay, on the one hand, food poisoning, yikes. On the other hand, styrofoam is basically plastic, and you're putting lava hot steak on this plastic, and you're going to ingest God knows what chemicals from the styrofoam melting into your steak. So, anyway, so he does that kind of stuff. Then the bigger one that he does pretty regularly is he will handle raw meat, and instead of washing his hands, like you should, dear people of the internet, he does this. And he just wipes his hands with the raw meat juice. He wipes his hands on his shirt or his pants and just goes about his day. And he just walks away. And we've tried talking to him about it. And like, it just, oh, God. I should take charcoal every time that man cooks, honest to God. But again, this is why I'm very okay with industry standards and like the FDA cracking down on stuff and being kind of anal retentive because people like my dad exist and they have no idea how to handle raw meat. But anyhow, so what you should do is you should keep any sort of raw meat operation. If you're cutting and chopping or spatchcocking something, you should keep that on one cutting board, one area of your counter, not fraternizing with your fruits and vegetables and grains and anything else. Ideally, it has its own cutting board. In my opinion, this is where like a plastic or a glass cutting board is better than wood because I don't know if I'm convinced that you could sanitize a wood cutting board that thoroughly. So we use a plastic cutting board, especially for meat. And, whatever you touch, once you get the meat in the oven or the grill or whatever, clean the area, lots of soap and water, maybe a disinfectant spray, whatever floats your boat. Make sure you wash your hands thoroughly and then use new utensils and a new plate to take the cooked meat off of the grill or the oven or the whatever. And making sure that you're cooking the meat up to the proper temperature is pretty important. I never owned a meat thermometer and I don't think I ever saw a meat thermometer in my entire life, actually, until I got together with my husband.
Yeah.
And he checks the meat so that on the one hand, you're not undercooking the meat, which would risk some sort of infection, but also you're not absolutely killing it and turning it into a dried out brick either. So like you can kind of hit that sweet spot where it's adequately cooked, you're not going to get sick, and also it's enjoyable and it's still juicy. So meat thermometer goes a really long way. And then I for some reason have a particular flavor of ADHD where, I don't have ADHD that I'm aware of, but for some reason, remembering the proper internal temperature for various meats and fishes, I never remember, ever. Every single time I cook meat or seafood in my entire life, I have to Google internal temperature of salmon, internal temperature of chicken, or whatever, because I have no idea what it's supposed to go up to. My husband kind of like has that stuff memorized more than I do, but you can Google internal temperature of whatever meat item you're cooking and just make sure you get it up to the proper temperature. But yeah, I think the big thing is just washing your hands, washing the utensils of the cutting board and the area, and making sure that raw meat juices don't fraternize with other food. So to your point, that's probably what happened with the restaurant is, they probably had like, raw meat, like the chicken that went on your salad, like that was probably prepped and then they put it in the oven or they put it in the whatever. And then maybe somebody used the same cutting board to cut up a vegetable or the salad.
Or even like if it's on their hands,
gloves.
like again, there's so many different ways the cookie can crumble with food poisoning, I feel as though. But I know that I get on Armand too with him using spices and stuff. Like if he's spicing up, steak or something and he's like going back after he's touched the chicken to touch the spices. I get on him all the time, but now he's not going to get annoyed that I get on him because I'm like, Armand, you need to like not do that.
Yeah. Do you want to poop 87 times again or do you not?
Right. Which I was laughing. I told him, I was like, now will you just listen to me when I tell you to how you're preparing the food? But he's usually fairly good. It's just sometimes like when he is preparing it and throwing spices and herbs on things, and I just have to remind him. But I saw another family member pull out meat that they were going to use and like they were putting out fruit as an appetizer. So they were getting like grapes and blueberries and strawberries out, but they put them on, they unwrapped the meat from the butcher or whatever, and they put it on the as they unwrapped it, the paper from the butcher that had juice, like meat juice all over it. Yeah. Ooh. It was really gross.
That's gross. That's right up there with stuff my dad would do.
Right. One other thing in terms of safety with prepping and just is to consider storage as well. So, if your refrigerator goes out or something, I don't know, it might not be worth it, especially if you have a history to eat the meat that was in
Yeah.
there. Stuff like that could be a little bit dicey, like how you're storing it. I also just think even where you're storing it in the fridge too. That was something we learned in ServSafe, and I honestly don't remember exactly how they did it, but if I remember right, they don't want your raw meat and raw fish to be over
Because it
produce.
could drip down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about too. And even sometimes when you're storing it in the fridge, like a keep it in the butcher bag or something. We go to the butcher a lot, so they wrap it up in
Yeah.
paper, but like their hands are still kind of gross when they wrap it in that paper. So maybe keeping it in a plastic bag too versus taking it out and putting it directly in the fridge.
Yeah. We actually, Mike, luckily I married somebody who is very into meat safety.
Yeah.
So I guarantee with no studying, he would pass the serve safe thing with flying colors. I
Oh
guarantee
my
it.
gosh.
But what he does, so keeping raw meat up high in the fridge, it could drip, like juices or blood could drip down. But also what he does, like you don't necessarily want to keep it in an area of the fridge that doesn't get a lot of air circulation too. So like a crisper drawer or something doesn't really make sense. So what we do on one of the lower shelves of our fridge, we just have like a 9x13 pan, like a metal pan, and that's the raw meat tray. And only raw meat ever goes in there. Uh, Jess put bananas in there just the other day, and Mike almost had a heart attack. And I kid you not, the poor child, every time she wants a banana now, we have to go to the sink and wash the bananas with soap and water. And we feel so silly because we're washing a banana.
All right.
But that's the raw meat drawer, and it's the raw meat drawer for a reason because we want to keep any potential cooties separate from any of the other food in the fridge. But it is on a low shelf and it's out kind of in the open part of the fridge. It's not in a drawer. So it gets good circulation for the air. But that's not our point. So obviously if your power goes out and your refrigerator or freezer is without power for hours and hours, you might need to toss the meat. But something that we recently encountered with my parents' house, my mom likes to buy everything in bulk, but then my parents are not highly skilled at, do you know what FIFO is?
First in, first out.
First in, first out. So they will amass quite the inventory of food of various expiration dates in their fridge, and it's their brain lesion. You gotta love them. So their refrigerator tends to be very overcrowded. And recently, my mom actually thought that their refrigerator was dying slowly, and she was saying, "Oh, the stuff in the refrigerator doesn't feel as cold, and I think the fridge is dying. We have to get a new one." Well, Mike investigated. He had one of those like wire probe meat thermometers, So he had the thermometer on the outside of the refrigerator and he put the probe up like on the top shelf somewhere. The problem was that their refrigerator was so overstuffed that they weren't getting good air movement. And the refrigerator's fine. It's just that they filled it with too much shit. And
Right.
that's why, but Mike was concerned with that because then he's like, oh my God, like any of the meat in the refrigerator is really questionable now because it was potentially getting over that danger threshold, which I think is like 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
It's kind of creeping up on that. It was like right on the cusp of whatever the danger threshold was. And we kind of were cringing. So
Yeah.
just cleaning out the fridge every now and then and keeping it decluttered can go a long way for meat safety too.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're traveling or eating lunches and things like that, if food is going to be out in the open, I'm trying to think, it might be like 4 hours or something. I don't know. There might be a time limit with some of the perishable items of how long to keep them at room temperature. Like if you can't go to work and put your food in a fridge, like kids will bring food in a lunchbox. that kind of stuff could be, depending on probably your potential risk, could also determine how intensely to follow some of these rules too. Like some of them are going to be good for everybody, but I
Not
think if
handling raw meat and then just wiping it on your jeans.
right,
Like
that's
that's
going to be
a
good for
thing for
everybody.
everybody.
But, and I think even this next category of things, so we talked about eating in, but eating out definitely, in my mind, raises the variables to get food poisoning. A lot of times when people get food poisoning, it's out, eating out. And I will say too, if this would have happened to me in the midst of my gut issues, I think I would have freaked out. And I've been totally fine. I feel like mental wise, where, food poisoning can lead to SIBO, but I'm really not that worried about SIBO. Like, again, I'm just not really overly worried about the food that I had food poisoning, where I feel like in the past I would have freaked out more and maybe obsessed about it and had to do some big protocol or something
Yeah, it
after
would
the
have been really
fact.
triggering for you back in the day.
Right. It would have been more triggering for me. And I wasn't triggered. I feel like I was very calm. I think in the past I might have been more hesitant to eat out. Like I'm not going to change any of my eating out practices at this point personally. Again, I might not go to BW3s again, and there could be some minor things and typically I don't love ordering salads out anyway, because salad and lettuce in particular tend to be like a bigger food poisoning thing. I feel like every other day there's a
recall.
A recall from the Chipotle lettuce. So
I was actually going to bring that up, the food recalls, just briefly. And this is a moot point because we record these episodes a few weeks before they actually go live. But even just this week, my husband happened to see that there was a recall on frozen strawberry, Kirkland brand frozen strawberries. Mm-hmm. And he was like, oh my God, like you keep frozen fruit for smoothies and stuff. And to his credit, he went out to the deep freezer, pulled out the bag of strawberries, and it was not one of the ones that was recalled. So, it happens moderately frequently. I think there was a recall for like Jif or Skippy peanut butter not that long ago, but spinach and lettuce are probably the two of the bigger ones that get recalls pretty regularly.
Yeah, I feel there's reasonable action you could take if you're someone that has a big history of food poisoning. That makes sense to me. So again, maybe you are a little careful of lettuce, or you have maybe a few things that you're on the lookout for. But I still want to be able to travel and not be hindered by. I'm not going to be hindered by this experience. If it happens again, it happens again. It kind of is what it is. If it becomes a recurrent theme, maybe I'll pay more attention to it, and assess risk in a different way. But
well, and now traveling with yogurt, that was a good call, or some sort of probiotic. Even if you don't want to travel with yogurt, if you're flying or something. You could just bring a probiotic with you. You could bring a bottle of charcoal with you. Those things travel pretty well. And I will say, I don't think that there's necessarily evidence for this, but I'm going to hypothesize something. I know that they're two completely different things. And I don't want to make this too much of a mishmash episode, but I know that Culturelle and Floristore, which are two probiotics that are available at virtually every pharmacy on planet Earth, or I shouldn't say planet Earth, in the United States at least. Culturelle and Floristore both have some evidence that they can help reduce the incidence of traveler's diarrhea. And again, traveler's diarrhea and food poisoning, they're two different things, but I just thought I would throw that out there, that if those probiotics have some evidence that they might help with a similar kind of themed issue, like, a foreign bacteria that your system's not acquainted to gets it put into the microbiome and you get GI symptoms, kind of purging that out of your system. I could maybe see either or both of those being helpful for food poisoning if you were to get it in your system either right away or like once you had recovered and you were able to keep stuff down again. I could see either or both of those helping with that too. So,
Yeah, and I think probiotics can be great. I have been doing more prebiotics too. I had some 2FL in my supplement graveyard that was just brewing and, just trying to make sure you're getting a little bit of extra fiber as you're moving through the recovery made sense to me. So I've been doing a little bit of that too. So I feel like it's sort of broken down into just the immediacy of getting rid of the acute awful symptoms, and then there's just the aftermath after the fact where we could talk a little bit more about that too, because again, even just purging a lot, like if you're diarrheaing out and you're losing a lot of microbes, that is going to potentially disrupt the microbiome. Just the purge, and then the inflammation could disrupt the microbiome. Again, the inflammation could disrupt some of the immune functioning in the gut. So in terms of the aftermath, I think everyone's different, because I think some people are going to have food poisoning and have zero issue from a long-term standpoint, and they're just going to revert back to their homeostasis or where their gut typically functions. They blow through it without issue. And then other people, again, can develop immune dysregulation, more kind of inflammatory things that persist in the gut. And again, that could be something to discuss too. Probably thinking if you are someone that feels like things were not the same after a food poisoning incident, whether that was immediately after or maybe like 3 or 4 or 5 months after things just weren't the same. I don't think it has to be you have a food poisoning incident and then everything immediately gets messed up. Like, I do think sometimes there can be a lag time.
I've heard both from people.
Right. I know I feel as though we've discussed that before. But, it's something to maybe not hyper focus on, but just have somewhat of awareness of if you feel like your motility is slowing down, or you kind of have bowel movements that look funky, to maybe try some prokinetics. If you get bloating, like if you get more GI symptoms generally, maybe trying a prokinetic. Post food poisoning might make sense, especially if you have a history of consecutive food poisonings where there has been wonkiness post, maybe immediately trying a prokinetic at that point. Again, it doesn't have to be that day, but just, fairly quickly after the incident, starting a prokinetic, whereas other people, like for me in particular, I don't think I'm going to start a prokinetic, but I'll keep an eye out for any changes that I feel like warrant a prokinetic. And then take a prokinetic as needed.
I think kind of what you've described already, we could maybe zoom out and say the two things that probably everybody would benefit from is, number one is just rehabbing and nurturing your microbiome. Mm-hmm. So that's where the prebiotics, probiotics, fermented foods, dietary diversity, just nourishing yourself, like that sort of stuff comes into play. So I think that's the number one for everybody to do, is just after a food poisoning event, just focus on rehabbing and nourishing your microbiome as much as you can. For people who struggle with inflammation or autoimmunity, and like they know that that's a thing for them, or if they're feeling more inflamed in the aftermath of a food poisoning event, they could certainly do more anti-inflammatory stuff. So like turmeric, resveratrol, green tea, ginger, etc. I think that's reasonable for many people to do, maybe not everybody with food poisoning. And then the third one, which you just alluded to, is if you have had food poisoning recently and you already have a history of IBS or SIBO or gastroparesis, you might strongly consider layering in a prokinetic for at least a little while, because that's the mechanism how this becomes a root cause for SIBO, is that it disrupts your motility. So if you can kind of help your motility along, and help it with a prokinetic, that could be really helpful. But I don't think that everybody who has food poisoning needs to do a prokinetic necessarily.
Right. Right. Yeah, again, I think it's something to have on the horizon if, again, like for me in particular, like I've never had a food poisoning incident, so I'm not sure how this is going to go. But I do think I've worked with enough people where, you know, they've had 5 food poisoning incidences. So they have historical data on how they function post food poisoning incident and how they typically recover. And again, on whether that played into their SIBO situation or not. Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. And it's on my mind of in the next few months paying attention to like how things are functioning and if I need something like that or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think having some awareness of it is good, but not jumping on it right away is fine. Like, I think I described this maybe on the podcast, or maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe it was a Marco Polo between you and I, but I think we were recently laughing at how not trigger happy I am with my own health, and how like non-OCD-ish I am with my health.
Yeah.
Where some people, maybe something would happen and they would immediately get kind of triggered and be like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And they would start, you know, analyzing the crap out of it and taking all the things. And I tend to be the opposite, which I don't know, maybe I'm too far the other direction. But like after my surgery and I had the bag of antibiotics, you know, the first couple weeks post-op, I was like, I think I'm more constipated.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was like, I'm still recovering. I'm still probably getting the shit out of my system, the anesthesia out of my system. I'm still on the couch all the time. So I kind of knew something was up, but I didn't even give myself permission to think about it for those first couple weeks. Then like week 2 through week 6 post-op was kind of me going, yeah, I think I'm legitimately more constipated after that bag of antibiotics. I'm going to observe now. And I just observed and kind of band-aided it for like a month. And then finally, like 6 weeks post-op, I finally was like, I think I'm going to do something. Yeah, I'm going to do something now. And I did a little bit of stool testing, and then I finally got started on a probiotic. But yeah, it took me that long to be totally convinced that it merited my attention, and it merited even a second thought, because there's so much about our lives and our health that's just a little blip on the radar. And if
Right.
you just leave it be, it's going to go away on its own and you're going to be fine anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine, just considering the clients I work with, and I believe we work with very similar clients, that our clients are going to tend more towards jumping on things too quick, where it's like they don't give enough time for something to work or to run its course. Or at least that's what I typically see with my clients. It's
Yeah. Well, a lot
I've been
of people
trying
are
this
really
for a
deeply
week.
traumatized.
Yeah, I've been trying this for a week. No, nothing's worked. And I'm like, well, it might need longer. You might need longer than that. And again, maybe it is a supplement that you would see benefit from within a week. But yeah. Or again, if they have like a flare, wanting to do all the things
Yeah.
to get everything back to where it was, instead of maybe kind of just chilling for a minute and seeing if time can kind of take its course
Yeah.
with something like that. But yeah, I it's a tricky balance, because again, I tend to probably be more too proactive instead of waiting and listening. I think I'm getting better as time goes on to just take a chill pill sometimes and let things play out and then determine what I need to do, versus feeling like I have to have the exact plan mapped out or again, throwing a bunch of stuff at
protocol.
something.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And I will say, like, going too far the other direction isn't good either, because
Right.
then nobody wants to be the big dumb dummy who, like, has an actual heart attack and is like, oh, my arm's just sore.
Right. Right.
Like, no,
There's a
you're
fine
dying.
balance there of
Yeah.
the timing of taking action.
Well, and how urgent
Right.
the
Letting
symptoms
things,
are.
when to let
Yeah.
things play out and when to actually take action. There is a
Yeah.
fine line there, and it can have some nuance to it. But yeah, I think
Sorry,
you're right. Like,
you go ahead first, and then I have something to share.
I was just gonna say, not taking action could be deadly in a situation where you're having a heart attack and you're just
Yeah,
like,
or like a
what?
stroke or something. Well,
Right.
so you know what's funny? So I was going to use the next example of if you had a stroke and like half of your face stopped moving and you started slurring your speech, but then that made me think of one. So I've shared briefly before on this podcast, I had a pretty wicked case of Lyme disease when I was 14. It actually went to my central nervous system and I had to do a spinal tap to get it diagnosed properly. The funny thing is, though, so I remember the day it happened. It was like the first or second week of ninth grade. And I remember during the school day, earlier in the day, I remember seeing bullseye rashes, several of them. And they would kind of come and go throughout the day. And I was like, oh, that's weird. I knew what it was. I knew enough that I was like, oh, yeah, this is the Lyme disease bullseye rash. Woo-hoo-hoo. But I figured I'll get through the school day and I'll tell my mom when I get home, which maybe wasn't the smartest idea. But I just, I was like, oh, I know what this is. I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to get through the school day. Then the thing that finally motivated me to go to the school nurse and really like be proactive about it was when I got Bell's palsy and half of my face stopped moving. And I was like, oh, guys, this is really weird. I think I have to go to the nurse. So little did I know that I had my own example of this where
Yeah.
apparently it takes that much to get me to do things. But yeah, there's a fine balance between, again, like hypervigilance and jumping on things right away versus letting your body ride it out and just seeing, not even just writing it out, but thinking of your body is so amazing and resilient and strong. It's going to resolve a lot of stuff all on its own without help. So if you could just step back and let it do its thing, your body has a lot of survival mechanisms in place, and it's probably going to get back on the right track naturally if you just allow it to do that and you don't mess with it. So I think that's also part of it, is like just having faith that your body can heal itself and it can return to homeostasis all on its own with minimal to no intervention.
Yeah, you summed up pretty much how I felt after the fact, being like, oh, this is just kind of a blip, and I trust my body to move through it without much incident. So that's how I felt, and I was a bit surprised that I wasn't the other way. Like it was a pleasant surprise, and it was a reminder of how far I've come mentally after having some of the gut issues that I had in my past historically.
Well, and you had said, a couple years ago when you had the SIBO and the IBS stuff really bad, like you would have probably wigged quite a bit more
Right.
than what you did.
Right. Versus feeling confident that my body can handle it and can take care of me. And
now you
if
just
it
get
doesn't, and again, if it doesn't, I know what to do.
Yeah.
It was kind of a very chilled response.
Yeah.
I can handle whatever happens, but I'm fairly confident that my gut's going to be totally fine.
Yeah. And now we have this great opportunity to make fun of Armand and his gummy bears. He will never live that down. When I meet the man in person, I'll probably bring him some gummy bears.
Oh, and remember I was texting you about I was going to be a shit curtain, remember?
Yes, did you? Well, now you have to tell people what you mean by that.
Yeah, Armand was all worried on the car ride home if he was gonna be having urgent diarrhea in the car ride home. And I said, don't worry, I got you. I'll steal a towel from our crappy hotel, which I won't go into. Well, maybe I will. I'll go into it. They were very persnickety about toilet paper. I'm like, do you want us to just crap all over your bathroom with no toilet
Or do you want us
paper.
to give you $5?
Right.
Give us a 12-pack?
Yeah, they were just very persnickety about toilet paper. So like my husband went down asking for more toilet paper, and they were asking, "Did you book through us?" Like basically making it sound like if we booked through hotels.com or something or booking.com, they wouldn't give us the toilet paper. It was the strangest thing. So,
So weird.
but anyway, the hotel was a little underwhelming, but it was the place we used to go to a lot when we were kids, and it's a very good location on the slopes. But so I was saying, we'll steal this crappy hotel's towel and I'll just hold it up for you while you poop on the side of the road. And I said, I'll be your shit curtain. That's what I essentially dubbed it.
Yep.
So that's true love, is
It
when
is.
you're willing to hold up a very undersized, awful white hotel towel on the side of the road, on the side of the West Virginia mountains, so your husband can poop on the side of the road, which he didn't end up doing, but I was willing to die on that sword.
That's right. You still were willing to go there because you love him that much.
Yeah.
And what a story that would have been. Oh, Cece, the things you could have seen on that trip, if only you knew.
She definitely heard them, that's for sure.
The poor kid.
I know.
Haunt her dreams.
I know.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the bases, but let's just briefly, maybe 5 minutes, cover the post-infectious IBS, post-infectious SIBO thing. For those of you who want to dive more into this, we actually have a whole episode about post-infectious IBS. I do not know the number because I didn't look it up ahead of time. I'm sorry, you'll have to figure it out on your own. But the thing to know is that when you get food poisoning, you get an immune response against the bacteria and the bacterial toxin. So like the CDTB or the Staph aureus toxin, whatever it might be, your immune system recognizes one or both of those as a threat, and your body purges, either vomiting or diarrhea or both. You make an effort to purge that bad stuff out of your system, and your immune system is kind of mopping up the rest. So whatever residual can't be puked up or diarrheaed out, your immune system is on the case and is hunting those things. And normally, kind of the course of food poisoning for most people is that you get rid of all the offending pathogen and the toxin, either by physically removing it from your system or your immune system attacking and neutralizing the invader. And then once the invader is gone and the immune system kind of gets the memo that everything is safe, then you return to normal, right? Your immune system calms down. It's like, oh, okay, the threat is gone. We did it, guys. Yay. For some people, and I think we're still figuring this out, for some people, the immune system launches an attack against the bacteria and the toxin. I kind of explain it as the immune system looking at those two things and going, I know these are bad, so I'm going to get them. But then for some people, it sees a third thing and goes, that looks mighty similar to the thing over here that I know is bad. And if I know this thing is bad and this thing looks kind of similar, I'd better cross my T's and dot my I's, and I'd better get this too. But the third thing, that this too, is part of your enteric nervous system. It's a protein on the nerves of your intestines that regulate motility. So basically what happens is that inflammatory reaction and your immune system's efforts to protect you and cross the T's, dot the I's, like your immune system trying to be really thorough, ends up instigating an autoimmune attack on basically the nerves that run your motility. And that's why it can lead to IBS or SIBO, because your motility apparatus, it becomes more and more inflamed or more and more destroyed. And then you just don't have as many of these pacemaker cells anymore. But that's where prokinetics come in. So Dr. Pimentel's group studies this a lot, and they've said already that people with post-infectious IBS should probably take a prokinetic for a minimum of 5 years. I think that in his mind it has to be prescription, but just as a side note, there are herbal prokinetics that are wonderful. We also have a whole episode on prokinetics, so have at it. But prokinetics are things that can regulate motility. So this could be things like ginger or Motegrity as a prescription agent, or LDN, another prescription, artichoke. There's a lot of different options, but the herbal prokinetics seem to work really well in my experience. But that's kind of the mechanism behind it, is that the nerves that run your motility become compromised and they become the target of an autoimmune attack. It's just your immune system trying super duper hard to protect you, and it just goes one step too far in that effort to protect you. But in this model, oftentimes some degree of like anti-inflammatory support, maybe even things like vitamin D to induce more tolerance from an immune standpoint could be helpful. Certainly rehabbing the microbiome so that it gives favorable signals to the immune system, that would be very favorable for this. And then just kind of supporting motility or stimulating motility to the best of your ability for the years to come, just so that you're kind of band-aiding that symptom, the poor motility issue. You're band-aiding that for at least a couple years. But again, Pimentel and company say minimum of 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the executive summary on post-infectious IBS, post-infectious SIBO. There are tests for this. So like IBS Smart is the one that I usually use. There are others, but it measures the antibodies called antivinculin antibodies. It's important to note that these tests do not definitively rule out IBS or SIBO if they come back negative. The way that IBS Smart is kind of marketed and presented, it almost is like, you can rule in IBS and rule out other stuff. And like, if this comes back negative, then the person doesn't have IBS. And that's not true. It's just one flavor of IBS or SIBO.
Like a subtype.
Yeah, it's just a subtype. So, well, maybe not even a subtype. It's just you're identifying the root cause with this. But if you get a negative IBS Smart test, it doesn't mean that you don't have SIBO. It doesn't mean that you don't have IBS. It just means that the post-infectious food poisoning model is not your root cause, or it's very unlikely to be your root cause.
Right. 100%.
Yep. But yeah, I think that's all I've got. What do you think? Do you have anything else? Old Lady Amy?
The only thing I have is that I want to round up some troops. We're going to go to this BW3s and we're going to burn it to the ground.
Or call them and let them know. One or the other.
Right, one of those two.
One of the two.
But yeah, I'm just joking. Don't come at me, BW3s. Yeah, I think, again, like, yeah, I don't think I have anything else. I feel like we covered...
Okay.
We covered the shit curtain. We covered gummy bears.
Cece being on her own. Parenting herself for a while there.
Yep. Changing her own diapers like a pro.
Yeah. If only.
I know.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, maybe you're making me rethink my recommendation. Because, again, I've only really recommended traveling with a bottle of charcoal to people where this is like a chronic issue for them. Maybe all of us should just travel with a cheapo $10 bottle of charcoal.
Yeah.
And a cheapo bottle of Culture L. I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't hurt. I have a domestic flight coming up next month. Maybe I'll pop a couple bottles in my bag just in case. Not trying to be paranoid, but, you know.
Yeah, I think typically I'd almost assume charcoal would be easy to find most places. The hard part is if you're sick and can't really move.
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
And you're by yourself, you know.
Yeah.
Versus if you're with your family or something and they could run out and get you some charcoal from, you know, Whole Foods or something.
Yeah. Well, or like you said that your family went out and got you the Pepto-Bismol from the little mountain shack, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Well, that's a wrap, folks. You know the drill. We're on the internet. Come find us. So I'm at gut.microbiome.queen on Instagram. Amy is Amy_Hollenkamp_RD on Instagram. I'm also on YouTube. I'm sure that we're other places and I'm just blanking on it right now, but come find us somewhere. And if nothing else, we will see you right back here for the next episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. Until then, toodaloo.